This is Brother Ron, and welcome to We All Be News Radio and TV, the news-free Dixie for the 21st century.
What about George W. Bush, though? He got, 5 deferments or what that changed?
Bush was a jerk. One thing about Bush, you know all that whole flim-flam about him being A.W.L. from the Texas Air National Guard?
Right.
What it was about is they started having such a problem with drugs that they made everybody on flight crew status take a P test once a week. He stayed A.W.L. because he couldn't have passed it. He was a junkie. He did coke and the herb. See, he was a drunk, he did cocaine, and he did herb. And if you go up to where Yale is located and you take the town tour and you look at the entry book for the police department, you'll see all these times they busted George W. for public drunk and disorderly.
Wow.
He couldn't get a date according to his frat brothers, and his mama had to get him dates, and half the time they had to go rescue the date when George W. was passed out drunk.
And was he wow.
Bill Clinton were in the same fraternity, but it was not this other one that George W. was in with his daddy, known as Skull and Bones.
Okay.
Bill Clinton wasn't in that one.
And also, was George W. a cheerleader at Yale? Was he a football cheerleader or something like that?
Cheerleader at Andover.
Okay, because people talk about these.
They called Andover Bendover. And accordingly, he got embarrassed many times when his mama Barbara would take her shoes off and get down on the field and start helping the cheerleaders squad lead cheers in her bare feet.
Wow. That George W. was a regular old Harry Truman, it seems like.
Well, he was a clown. He used to sit in class and chew tobacco and spit in a paper cup. Everybody thought it was nasty as hell, and they all thought he was an ignorant fool with the nonsense he'd spout that was totally off point. He thought Catcher in the Rye was a communist plot.
So, I used to think that Jeb was the smarter Bush son, but I guess
he was.
What happened?
See, George W. got in on a legacy, and a year after he was admitted on the legacy of his daddy, they stopped it, and you had to get in on grades and aptitude tests. See, George Herbert Walker went into the military directly out of high school. And as a matter of fact, he has an interesting, unique distinction in the whole military apparatus of World War II. He was quite literally the youngest pilot in the U.S. military, combat pilot in the U.S. military. He was a naval pilot. He got shot down in a TBF torpedo plane, and perhaps unfortunately for the country, he almost got captured. If he had been captured, it was at a place called Iwo Jima, I-T-O, not Iwo.
Okay.
And the commandant there was a little sadist. He used to take the American pilots, kill them, and barbecue their livers, and they would have a party with sake and barbecued liver.
Wow.
He just barely managed to not get swept in by the tides on this rubber raft he was on, and wound up getting picked up some days later and rescued. Otherwise, we would have had a footnote. He was a barbecue menu item rather than the president. He wasn't a very good one, but he was sensible enough not to totally depose Hussein and leave a power vacuum like this idiot son of his did.
Yeah, but he produced that idiot son. That's what I'm saying.
Well, they didn't like him in the family.
But maybe we was in better off if he did get, barbecued. I'm just joking.
So what I'm saying. Jeb was supposed to be the one, and the family looked at George W., George Wacko, as ruining it for Jeb. I know that the word was that George Herbert Walker Bush had to buy off a number of young ladies that George W. got knocked up when he wasn't whacked out drunk.
Wow.
I mean, he did a whole lot of crazy stuff, according to the police blotter up there where Yale is. Now, see, his father, George W., aside from being the youngest combat pilot in the American military in World War II, got back out, went to school at Yale. After he got out, he was captain of the football team, captain of the baseball team, and he got his 4-year college degree in just 2 years and graduated summa cum laude.
Okay.
And was Phi Beta Kappa. That was George Herbert Walker Bush, not his dumb George W. Bush. Now, the L.A. Times reported his GPA and SAT when he got in, and the SAT wasn't that high, and he had a 1.7 grade average, which was a D grade average to get in Yale on a legacy thing.
Man, what if George W. Bush was a black dude with those type of credentials?
He wouldn't have got past Yale.
He wouldn't have been president. He would have been a lot of things. Wow, that's amazing. So white privilege is real.
Right. He's a real clown.
Wow.
See, this is interesting.
Okay.
George W.'s grandfather, George Herbert Walker Bush's father, was Prescott Bush.
Mm-hmm.
Prescott Bush had been United States Senator from Massachusetts, and when he retired, John F. Kennedy got his seat.
You sure that wasn't Connecticut and it was Herbert Lodge that Kennedy got seat from, the Lodge guy?
That was Massachusetts. It was Prescott Bush. Now, the other thing about Prescott Bush, even though he was a Republican, he backed up and encouraged Harry Truman to sign Executive Bill 1981 that integrated the armed services. See, they were discussing that, and white generals were saying black folk were incompetent. But there is an anecdotal story that says, as Commander-in-Chief, Truman was looking at the report for Red Flag, which was the fighter competition that the U.S. Army Air Corps had 1946, 1947, and then again in 1948. And he noted that the black folk from the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd, won it in 1946, and he had just gotten an announcement that they had won again in 1947 while these generals were telling them that they were incompetent to do stuff like fly fighter planes. He'd also gotten the advisement that they weren't allowed to receive their trophies in the Reno Hotel or casino where the celebration was to be held. Now, as a result of that, Truman took the risky step for a white politician of being the first U.S. president ever to address the NAACP. And he made a famous speech that got later suppressed, and he said he could see no earthly reason why Negro Americans should not and could not and would not be treated the same as white ones when it came to politics, residences, and everything else. So he signed 1981, Executive Order 1981, and Prescott Bush encouraged him. Another thing, Prescott Bush backed up Eisenhower when he took on that rabid clown, Joe McCarthy, who was going around, running around trying to make everybody a commie. Another thing, too, when King was getting bailed out of jail during the Civil Rights era, it developed that Prescott Bush was basically the surety on every bond that needed one. So he was from Massachusetts. George Herbert Walker Bush had relocated to Texas to deal with energy. Now, the great grandfather, not grandfather, the uncle to George Herbert Walker Bush was George Herbert Walker. In 1946 and 47, George Herbert Walker chartered Halliburton in Oklahoma. Halliburton had been chartered in 1919 and then allowed to go defunct, but George Herbert Walker rechartered it in 1946, and Halliburton was about energy. So George Herbert Walker Bush, his nephew, made a lot of money by listening to the advice of Uncle Herbie and buying up the mineral rights of property holders who had holdings that surrounded what became oil strikes. So they'd go in and pay cash for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25% of the mineral rights and then start hitting it big within a year or two. George Herbert Walker Bush founded Zapata Oil Company to handle that. Now, interestingly enough, the Walker Bush family had a holding company to handle all of their enterprises, and it was known as Zapata Offshore Oil Inc. And believe it or not, it was chartered in Kuwait. Now, there might be a coincidence or it might be the cause, but when the U.S. got involved in the Iraq-Iran Kuwait situation in 1990, or rather the Iraq-Kuwait situation, it just so happens that when Hussein had invaded Kuwait and nationalized everything, that nationalized the Bush family fortune, so they were destitute until they went in and took Kuwait back. Kuwait had been separated off in 1922 from Iraq so the Royal Navy could get oil. The British government bought 51% of a company known as Anglo-Persian Oil, which is now BP, so they could exploit the oil resources, and sent the Royal Marines in and split off Kuwait. There were the shenanigans on that. You've heard of this Lawrence of Arabia. They did a movie.
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking about that when you said that. Yes, sir.
Well, his task was to go find some place that they could annex for oil, and that was Kuwait.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an interesting hookup. And then you get rabidly right-wing George W. Bush, who was just an irresponsible, dumb jerk, who might have been cunningly brilliant to set the Bush family up to move to a different level of wealth. The Bush family started in enterprise when a great-grandfather started up an iron foundry in Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And then after World War I, that Bush had become identified by Carnegie and Rockefeller, and they bought up a lot of the German war-making industry after World War I and consolidated it and appointed that Bush to be head of the corporate holding company that managed them. So all through the 20s, 30s, and World War II, that Bush was getting a check from the Nazi Germans who were depending upon that war industry to make their tank engines and a few other things. The Bush family had been into what they call paper entrepreneurialism. That is, instead of running a company, you buy the company up and sell off its assets for gain. You were into international information, read I Spy stuff, and into energy development. That's what the Bush family's been into for more than 100 years. Now, when the Gulf War II started, it developed that France, Russia, the U.S., and some others were attempting to influence Hussein into having him sign a contract to let Halliburton exploit the Iraqi oil. he did not do that. And he signed a contract with the French and the Russians. So there is a plausible theory that we got involved with all this sham about weapons of mass destruction to give us bogus justification for going in there so Halliburton could exploit the oil. Now, they wound up exploiting the oil resources of Kuwait. They got the position without bid at the end of the fracas in 2007 and 8. And the last I checked 10 years ago, Halliburton was netting $2.3 million every 7 hours over there. So that may have been a brilliant, cunning effort to set up a fortune for the family. Also, the thing about Afghanistan, you notice we invaded Afghanistan in 2001, not 2003, under the pretext that Al-Qaeda was over there. But it's interesting to note that Halliburton had been attempting to get pipeline rights, understanding Halliburton is actually a Bush family enterprise. Now, George Walker Bush signed an executive order in May 2001 giving the Taliban $45 million in military aid, principally night vision devices, which came back and haunted them. That was in May 2001. That was before September 9/11. But coincidence, this something that, of course, the press overlooked because it wasn't salacious enough. They'll cover somebody giving a head job or having a little sexual escapade, but they won't cover anything like that. Anyway, that's a long about connection between the Bushes and what happened. We get away from Kane.
My thing is, I think it's kind of weird that people are full of crap. The same folks that believe in Santa Claus and Tooth Fairies are the same ones that act like George W. Bush didn't commit these crimes against humanity, where they want to just invite Donald Trump for funerals. But wasn't not George W. Bush with the Afghanistan and 9/11 happened on his watch and the Iraqi war? What about these things, Katrina?
Well, yeah, but you see, here's the deal. Every president you have had recently has been a friend of LGBTQ.
Okay.
Hollywood, advertisement, and the news media have been about LGBTQ. Most of their executives and the membership thereof are the same thing. So Trump is an enemy of their program. So without them telling you, that's why they attack him. And a lot of stuff they bring out about him is worse in the commission by several of the last few presidents, but they didn't bring that out. And they don't bring it out, and they just generally attack him. And because they attack him and wish to associate him with certain elements of society that we should hear about, we now hear about it, whereas they ignored it before.